You'll wish you saw this one sooner when Jordan Peterson was pitted against two woke panelists on the issue of gender relations. I think the facts and historical perspective he brought basically paralyzed the panel into silence, but that's not all that makes this clip so enlightening, because this short segment crams in so many tangents that we need to explore that will jolt you out of the one-dimensional story of feminist history that you've likely been taught. Just take a look at this next clip before I tell you how.
Isn't the real problem that quite a lot of men, and also young men, are struggling to deal with the fact that women now are more in control of their lives than earlier?
I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is that the idea that the West is a patriarchal tyranny is rapidly translated into the idea that young men who strive forward are to be regarded with suspicion because they're doing nothing but manifesting the same sort of tyrannical power that has kept women oppressed for the last 2,000 years. And I think that entire narrative is appalling, right to the core. So, and I don't see that it's helpful to anyone, because making young men weak or failing to encourage them to be strong, that's a better way of putting it, certainly does the young men no good, and it doesn't do the young women any good at all if they want to find a partner.
So you're saying that all along women and men have had the same opportunities, always?
No, I'm basically saying that all along, hardly anyone had any opportunities. I mean, if you look at the history of the world, things really started to shift in about 1895. But before 1895, the typical person in the West lived on less than $1 a day in today's money, which is about 2/3 the UN cutoff for abject poverty by today's standards. And so what happened through most of the history of the world is that men and women struggled mightily together, sometimes at each other's throats, but mostly cooperatively, to keep the wolf from the door and the tyrant at bay. Life was very, 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 very difficult. And the fact that we survived it all meant that fundamentally we cooperated, despite the fact that we're rife with stupidity, ignorance, and malevolence.
But what's so terrifying with gender equality?
Nothing.
So curious.
Except when people gerrymander the data, it's like, what do you mean by equality? Do you want women to have their free choice or not? If you do, they're not going to pick occupations that are the same as the occupations men pick.
But we have structures today that women need to struggle. They need to take a step to have the possibility to become like a prime minister. As we talked before, we don't have had any prime minister in Sweden that have been a woman, for instance. We have a lower rate of female entrepreneurs. Men had a higher income than women in Sweden, even if they work with the same tasks. And we need to work with.
That's one that I would
We need to work
dispute.
with gender equality, I think, even in the lower class in schools, to learn kids how to play with dolls or how to.
That's the most fundamental debate in all of psychology that she seems to simply assume the answer to, the nature versus nurture argument. It's often oversimplified, but it's well established that humans are both a product of our genetic predispositions as well as the environment that shapes us. Do you know the only kind of person that would love the idea of complete social constructionism? It's people that want to deconstruct and rebuild human nature in the image of their own ideology. That's precisely what you see in the debate around which version of equality is it that feminism truly demands, equality of opportunity or outcome. The moment that you make equal outcomes your guiding North Star, even a feminist would be willing to steamroll female choice in order to bring about the ideological utopia. Isn't that exactly what you see punctuated at different times in the feminist movement? Sure, it's an idea that's still on the fringes, but the last 2 decades are a case study in how the fringes can become mainstream opinions very quickly. A French feminist icon, Simone de Beauvoir, actively made the point in the 1970s that women should be stripped of the choice of being stay-at-home moms. And why? Well, hear what she says in her own words, and I quote, "No woman should be authorized to stay home to raise her children. Women should not have that choice because if there is such a choice, too many women will make that one. And that's just as condescending to women as the idea that free female choice in the Scandinavian countries today is the impediment to their version of equality.
I think we need to learn boys to be more sensitive, but also young girls to become more self-confident. And I think that's very important to build
the problem with that is the data indicate that the consequence of the policies that you're promoting have maximized the differences between men and women. So that isn't what it's doing. Now, that isn't to say that the movement towards egalitarianism is necessarily a bad thing, but a tremendous amount of that's being driven not by social policy, but by technology. I mean, you know, the narrative that we're fed now is that up until 1960, when the enlightened feminists developed their egalitarian doctrines, men had kept women down, and they finally rose. And the truth of the matter is that from about 1895 onward, there was a series of technological revolutions that were extraordinarily powerful in their impact that allowed women to step forward free of many of the burdens that had kept them back in the past. Birth control being one of them, but only one. Sanitary facilities of all sorts, plumbing had a huge role to play, tampons had a huge role to play, as did sanitary napkins. All of these technologies developed that enabled women to move forward with less biological impediments, let's say.
But of course it will have differences in choice, of course, because we are human beings. But I can't see why it differs between me and Skavlan, for instance. But of course it differs in biological things, but not in choices, because I think more how we raise them, how we live, education, sort of culture, attitudes form a human being, whether or not they are a girl or a boy when they grow up. Mm-hmm. And if I raise my daughter to become a leader, to be self-confident, to have a high education, for instance, I think she will have a good platform to become a civil engineer, to become a CEO of a company, or to become a nurse.
Well, that is what people who think that the differences between people who are primarily culturally constructed believe, but it's not what the evidence suggests. What's necessary to understand about this is not a contentious issue among informed scientists. We've known this for 25 years. And so, and it's a perverse effect. No one expected it.
That's such a reality check to all of us. There's a tendency for people to overestimate the impact of their actions in creating large social changes over things like technology and the natural evolution of culture. You know what makes every social movement in history unique in one aspect? It doesn't just prescribe what it wants the future to be, but also contains its own reading and version of history that it wants to teach. In the case of the feminist movement, even if you agree with what it offers women in the present and future, it's hard to agree with how it reads the past. The idea that men, being 50% of the population on average, systematically oppress the other half of the population should come across as absurd, because it is. It assumes that men lived much greater lives on the backs of those oppressed women, when in fact the vast majority of men in history had a terrible life in every way imaginable. Take, for example, wars and conflicts, which have practically been routine for most of human history at one place or another in the world. It was always the men that would get conscripted to military service under the draft. In fact, there's little or no instances in history of women being forced to fight and lose their life for a king and kingdom that likely also oppressed them. That oppression wasn't on a gender basis, but on a class and power basis. The men were disposable cannon fodder in war for the rulers, and their physical strength, even as young as age 15, were made to serve the mighty kings. And speaking of kings, let me paint you a picture of the kind of life that they lived 300 or 400 years ago, compared to the average person today, which I think will show you how it's technology above all else that has emancipated us. A king's life was one of constant looming threat of invasion and war, while he lived in a cold, dark, and damp palace. There was no entertainment and virtually no protection against life-threatening disease, since medical science was still primitive. There was no such thing as household power or electricity, complex navigation, transportation, or anything that we take for granted in our day-to-day 21st century life. In fact, I don't think there's a single person on the planet that's living even a low to moderate lifestyle that would trade their place with a king from 400 years ago. And when you realize that it was actually technology and our political evolution rather than identity-based social movements that got us to our modern life, you will start to view both men and women in history united in their attempts to escape poverty and oppression from the tiny ruling elite, rather than antagonistic. Social movements do play a role, like the suffragist movement, which was an example of one that was truly successful, but we would be missing a large part of the picture focusing solely on our own crafted version of history, rather than what it really teaches. Take this idea to the last century and you find a similar pattern, with women step by step being freed of their impediments through technology, whether that be through sanitation technology or the invention of machines that could replace their household chores like washing machines and the refrigerator. In that case, Jordan Peterson is bursting the self-righteous bubbles of much of today's activism, and I think that's what we just saw on this panel. But perhaps he understands that giving credit to the right things is the first step towards understanding our evolution as a society and where we want to go next.